Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new and notable nonfiction panel. My name is Allison MacLachlan. I'm the marketing manager at Owlkids Books, and I'll be moderating this discussion. Today, we're highlighting a few of our newest and upcoming nonfiction books in conversation with their authors and an illustrator. So before we turn it over to them, I'll start by introducing our panel and their books. First, which you see on the screen here, Flow, Spin, Grow, Looking for Patterns in Nature. This is a nonfiction picture book for ages 4 to 8 that introduces readers to major patterns in the natural world, things like branching, spiraling, and spinning. It first published in 2018 and released in paperback in March 2022. It's illustrated by Todd Stewart, and author Patchen Barss is here with us today. He has written, edited, and produced stories about science, research, and culture for more than 20 years for print and television, and he lives in Toronto. Next, we have the duo behind Same Here, The Differences We Share. This is a book for ages 8 to 12, and it explores how kids around the world live and the common needs that unite them. It just published in April 2022. Author Susan Hughes has written many books, both fiction and nonfiction, for kids of all ages, including the bestseller Off to Class. She lives in Toronto. Illustrator Sophie Casson is also here with us today. She has illustrated a number of children's books, and her art has also appeared in publications, including the New York Times. Sophie lives in Montreal. And finally, last but not least, we have Secret Schools, True Stories of the Determination to Learn. This is for ages 9 to 12, and it takes a really undercover look at some of the world's most secretive schools through history. It's coming out in September, and it's illustrated by Erin Taniguchi. Author Heather Camlot is here with us today. She's a journalist and the award-winning writer of the previous nonfiction book, What If Soldiers Fought with Pillows, as well as a couple of novels for young adults, and she lives in Toronto. So a very warm welcome to all of our panelists, and please feel free to join us with your video, and we will get started. Hello, hello. So for our attendees, we will have a few minutes at the end for questions, so please do feel free to type those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If you have any general comments, please feel free to use the chat function, and we'd love to hear what you think. So now on to the questions. I'd love to know, with all of these books, what first sparked the idea? What was the first gem of an idea to be writing this? And Patchen, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. I mean, the idea of writing about patterns in nature is something that I've done and wanted to do for maybe 30 years or so. This book started, I think it actually started in a creative writing course I took really 30 years ago, where it was a terrible dialogue between a teacher and a student about patterns in nature. And over the years, it evolved into, it was a coffee table book for a while. It was a museum exhibition. It was took a bunch of other forms. And the form it took in the end happened to come right when my kids were the exact right age to read this kind of book. So that was kind of what inspired me to make it what it actually turned out to be.
Thank you. And what about Heather? What about you? Secret Schools, how did that first come to you?
Interestingly, Secret Schools started while I was researching my previous book, What If Soldiers Fought with Pillows? I was looking into the bombing of Guernica in Spain, and I learned about a secret school that was teaching the Basque language. I had already known about secret schools in the Jewish ghettos, and I thought with, sort of a lead on two secret schools, I decided to do some research, excuse me, on whether there were more secret schools around the world.
Awesome. And looking at Same Here, so Susan, how did that idea first come to you? And then we'll follow that with Sophie. What did you first think of when you were approached about illustrating? So Susan, I'll start with you. Oh, and you're just muted.
Patchen beat me out here because I thought my idea was going to come the furthest back. In fact, the book came out in April, and I've been asked a few times where I first got the idea, and I couldn't even remember. But I looked back through all my many, many, many drafts and Word documents of this story, and I suddenly remembered that over 12 years ago, I was researching for another project, much like Heather had been doing, And I was reading about different foods around the world and read about flour dropped in oil and how this was a treat enjoyed in many, many countries. And we know it as donuts, but in other cultures, they have different names for it, and it's in different shapes, and it's sweet or it's sour. So it has a similarity that we all enjoy, but it's presented in many different ways around the world. And that idea sparked, it's also something kids enjoy. And that idea sparked the idea of creating a book that had that concept at its kernel.
Nice. I like that it began with donuts.
Yeah.
And Sophie, when this manuscript came to you, or when this idea was presented to you, what did you think at first?
Well, what really drew me in was the aspect of how it was written from the point of view of the children. And I thought that was very engaging for me. And immediately it led me to the direction that I wanted to make realistic portraits of their children, these children, so we could really see, they could really be live characters that we could imagine, and really perhaps the readers could really engage in these portraits. So that came quite fast to me. So yeah.
Nice, thank you. One thing I'm really especially interested in with all of these books is it seems like they could be for a variety of age ranges depending on how you create them. So how did you determine what age you were going to target this at? Was that a decision you made? Was that a decision you made with your editor? How did you figure that out? And did that change as you worked on the book? Let's start with Heather this time.
So the funny thing is, every time I try to write for a different age group, it keeps ending up being middle grade. So essentially, I also knew though for this one that because I'd had the experience writing What If Soldiers Fought with Pillows, that Secret Schools would sort of follow the same template, if you will, with 15 different little stories and an introduction and conclusion. And when I discussed it with my editor, Stacy, that just seemed to be the right fit and the right age for something that was, it's historic, but some stories are a little scarier than others, and it just fit better with a middle grade audience.
Nice. What about Same Here? That's targeted at a similar age range. So Susan, was that always the plan, or did that evolve?
In my mind, it began as a picture book for a picture book audience. Again, maybe because it started with donuts, and it began as a simpler idea. And as I worked on the manuscripts and created more drafts, and then even after Owl contracted it, it kept changing and shifting. And it ultimately, although it would work well for a picture book audience, and I think picture book kids who read picture books will really enjoy it, as will their parents. It's targeted at middle grade because some of the concepts, some of the narratives, although they're short, some of the things the characters say have a little more maturity to them. There's a reference to a town nearby being bombed. One child talks about the carbon footprint. And it also gave me more breadth to allow the characters to talk about things and to know things that maybe younger kids wouldn't. So when they reflect on their community or their school, the comments they make are just a little more sophisticated. So I think also the publisher and I wanted to target it to middle grade to signal to librarians that this is a book to offer to middle grade kids, because there's so much depth beyond what the words say, and so much of this is due to Sophie's amazing art. It's so evocative and creates opportunities to go really deep with concepts despite what you see superficially on the page. So I'm really excited about the breadth of audience it will attract.
Yes, and I'll hop to Sophie now before we talk about Flow, Spin, Grow. So can you tell us, Sophie, about how illustrating middle grade nonfiction was different from illustrating for younger audiences like you've done both. So what was that like?
Well, a little bit like Heather, I am drawn to middle grade because the work I do in editorial work, I use a lot of metaphors in my work. And so there is an opportunity in middle grade to use that aspect and create, images that carry metaphor. And as Heather was saying, it was perfect because there was more depth. Even if there was, 3 or 4 lines of text, there was a lot of, it evoked sometimes problematics or like bigger stories. So there was an opportunity, although I wasn't drawing a character that was going through a story, but all individual characters, there was an opportunity to create stories within most of them. So that was exciting that I could place that and play with that. And I think yeah, the text and the images carry levels of interpretation and thought. So yeah, I'd say that's where the major difference, compared to what I would do with perhaps a younger audience.
Nice. Okay, that makes sense. So Patchen, I'm going to return to the age question for you, because I think Flow Spin Grow is the kind of thing, you could probably write a PhD thesis on patterns in nature to some degree. So how did you determine what age group you wanted to target that for?
So my instinct was to go as young as possible. And the reason behind that was because a major part of what I do for a living is talk to scientists. I'm writing a biography of a Nobel Prize winning physicist right now. I interview physicists and cognitive neuroscientists, AI researchers all the time. And there's a certain temperament when you are a scientist that is, you're always asking questions. You're skeptical of everything. Every question leads to a new question. And while I was working on the book, my kids were between 2 and 4 years old, and they had the exact same temperament, which was everything was questioned, everything was skeptical. And I actually, while I was writing the book, created a quiz called Who Said It, a 4-year-old or an advanced research scientist, where I used the titles of papers from peer-reviewed journals and mix them up with questions my kids had asked, and no one can get 100% on that quiz. And so because Flow Spin Grow is essentially an invitation to be a scientist, to discover the beauty and the meaning of the world, I wanted to target it as early as possible in people's lives where they are in that, they still have that complete sense of discovery and newness and questioning and figuring out how things work. So that was where I wanted to go with it.
Nice. And a follow-up question. What were some of the techniques that you used to make this science, math content engaging for really young readers?
Yeah, so there were parts of it that were tricky because there are, I mention in the book, there's mention of subatomic particles, there's mention of things in outer space and that sort of thing. One of the main things that I really tried to focus on was that when you go out and discover these things, you're not just discovering stuff that's out there, but I really tried to emphasize the message that you are a part of all of this at all. So with every pattern that I discuss, I always try to bring it back to this pattern is in you. You are a product of the same things that created the planets and the plants and the shells and all of the other things that are there. And I think placing the reader in the narrative is something that can be helpful in helping the lights go on, for even for little kids. So.
That's such a cool part of that book for sure. Like even all the comparisons between the spiral of, say, our inner ear is the same kind of pattern that we see in galaxies spiraling.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to switch gears to a slightly different question, which is a couple of these books focus on kids from all around the world. So secret schools, we have a lot of examples from history and across the globe. Same here. We're looking around the world as well. So I'm interested in what kind of research you as authors and illustrators did, or what resources you used to ensure accurate representation, and how questions of diversity, equity, inclusion factored into your project. Big question, a lot to discuss. And I know, Patchen, I'm interested in your thoughts as well. I'll start with Susan. How did these questions play into Same Here?
So that's a great question, because essentially it was one of the biggest challenges with this book, but it was also one of the most exciting parts of writing this book and creating with Sophie. because essentially that's the goal of the book. It's to show young readers through art, through the visuals, through the text, that the world is full of other kids living a variety of lives, and showing this in a fairly realistic way. So to do that, it has to address those elements. That's sort of the nature of what we're trying to do. Achieving it is something else and very difficult. And it was our goal from the start, years ago when this project began. I spent hours and hours researching different countries to try to determine what content to include. I cross-checked, I updated references constantly. When an editor came on board and we started looking at the structure of the book was divided into 9 chapters, each one of the needs of kids. And then it became apparent that in order to actually show the breadth of kids around the world, the book needed to be longer. So instead of 32 pages divided into 9 sections, it became 48 pages and then 64, just to allow for more variety and more diversity of kids. We discussed endlessly which countries to include. I think there's over 50 countries represented in the book. And then we would shift those around. I would do more research. And again, every narrative that I wrote, we were trying to be inclusive of gender, looking to see there was a balance of kids living in urban environments and rural environments, that there was different economic backgrounds reflected, that family structures were different and reflected in the visuals or in the text. So the partnership between text and art was very important, because as Sophie said earlier, not everything is in the words. The art was showing much of this diversity. And throughout, we're trying to look at our own personal biases, eliminate those, try not to make assumptions. I contacted a librarian in Chile to make sure that the public libraries there do allow kids to take books out, because I know I learned some library, I just assumed, of course, that's what a public library does, but apparently not in all countries. So I tried to make no assumptions and be totally unbiased, which is very difficult. And I want to hand this discussion over to Sophie now, because she's going to continue discussing the process.
Yes, I know there was much back and forth, and for the two of you in particular, this took a very long time before you felt it was exactly right. So yeah, Sophie, do tell us about your perspective here. Oh, and you're just muted as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so there was great support from the editor in the research. I had asked for it because I knew that, over 50 countries to research, plus all the drawing, months and months of drawing. If I wanted to pull through, I needed the support, and I got great support. So I had a lot of, for each country, I had at least 4 photographic images, and that was my base. But then for each country, I really needed to do more research, because I wanted to capture the right atmosphere, make sure, I knew about the kinds of religions, that, all things that could appear and create a unique aspect of that country or that child, because I was working also in the perspective of creating portraits that I felt I wanted to be realistic. It's not photographic realistic, it's in my style, but realistic in the lives of these children. It was really important for me to get the manner, the body manner, that kind of aspect. And so relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right from the beginning with the editor, we discussed in depth the skin tones, because my palette is a very vivid palette, and immediately I had sent samples of the direction I wanted to take, and the colors of the skin weren't necessarily going to be natural colors, but there was, in the interpretation, we could tell, you know, if this person perhaps was a white person, a darker person. So there was variety in the skin tones, but in a very open way. And so we discussed it in depth, and, you know, I showed samples, and at some point we went forward. And then, you know, everything was gone out of sight, out of mind. And Owlkids came back and said, oh, you know, we've had a sensitivity read with Same Here, and there are certain issues that we really need to address before it gets printed. And so there were many, many changes that needed to be made, that it was a really big learning curve for the whole team. Yeah, I really had to sit down and reshape and notice how my white bias was a lot more present than I thought. So yeah, we reworked a lot of skin tones that needed to be more realistic. So, you know, I had to walk out of my usual palette, and because we were looking to make a better book, and it was really important for me that the children have something in their hand in which they could recognize themselves and engage, and not be, you know, perhaps looking at something in which they, you know, that, yeah, there were mistakes in what I'd done. And so we reworked that. I know Susan had to rework text as well. But in the end, you know, it made a better book. I was really proud of where it went. And we also had to think, so that was a skin tone issue, but we also had to think about the hard word to say, representativity, because the context of the children, because there was one child per country most of the time, if a child was represented in an environment where they were poorer, we didn't want that to reflect necessarily negatively on the whole country, and that show that, you know, all the children in this country were poor. So we had to adjust in that way. So, you know, the sensitivity read was very in-depth and accurate, and put the finger on the right aspects. And so I think, you know, we were real winners to in the end.
It's amazing how much there is to think about that readers may not initially sort of notice when they come to the book, but so much thought and care, I know, went into every step of that process. Thank you for telling us more about that. Heather, I'm sure you faced similar questions of representation when you were trying to choose certain examples. So can you speak a little bit about your experience with that?
Yeah, so it's very similar to what Susan and Sophie had said. To begin with, for Secret Schools, it was global representation. Same with Susan and Sophie, making sure that we really did get around the world. It was very easy to find schools in Europe, for example, secret schools in Europe. And because of that, the Basque school that I was talking about before actually didn't even make it into the book, because we had too many from Europe. And so we had to make sure we had South America and North America and Asia and et cetera, et cetera. So that in itself was a challenge, because of course they're secret schools. So unless, you know, they don't really exist anymore, it's very hard to find a secret school that's contemporary. So that was kind of our first challenge, but we did it. We made sure to do it. And in terms of diversity and inclusion, you know, just like we wanted to globally represent, we wanted to culturally represent as well. It's extremely important for me to have my own culture represented when I can in my books, and to do so accurately. And so we have a section in Secret Schools that actually talks about cultural specific connections. So for example, we spoke about Japanese language schools in Brazil and the indigenous Quechua language in Ecuador. We also talked about education of the enslaved in the United States, and we talked about the Jewish ghettos and secret schools there during the Holocaust. So we really did try and go around the world and culturally diverse as possible when we did this, because I just think books are such an opportunity to inform and educate kids, more than just our little corner of the world, but about the world that we live in. And I take that really seriously. So we try to be as diverse culturally and globally as possible.
That's great. Thank you for that answer. I think it is something that so many authors are taking very seriously, and it's nice to hear a little bit more about that thought process, because there's so much that goes on behind the scenes. Before we turn to the Q&A, I'll just ask Patchen if you have maybe a similar or a different perspective on the question of representation and inclusion, because your book is similar but different. Like, it's very universal experience for kids. So in that way, it is reaching a lot of different communities. We all have experiences with nature. Were you having to think about these questions as you were working on Flow, Spin, Grow?
Absolutely. It was a really big concern for me, because science and mathematics especially have this reputation as being sort of exempt from any ideas about culture, race, gender, that they exist as this kind of absolute above the fray. And of course, that's absolutely not the case. And I'm very aware that if you ask a kid, what does a scientist look like? They're very likely to say a white guy with Albert Einstein hair. Like, even at that point, the onslaught of stereotypes has already shaped what they think of. And so when I was going into this, a lot of it was reflected through the illustration, but also through the writing. I wanted as much as possible for kids not just to be able to imagine anyone as being a scientist or have their image of a scientist be more diverse than Albert Einstein, but I wanted them to be able to imagine themselves as a scientist, because that's really what is at the core of that book. And that meant them being able to see themselves as much as possible in the writing, in the illustration, everything about it. I wanted them to feel like the story was about them. And so it guided all of the wording and the choices of the images and how we structured it. So
that's a great point. And actually, if you look at the cover of Flow, Spin, Grow, it's very much that one child right on the cover, which suggests it is starting from the child's experience. So yeah, for sure that comes through, I think. Thank you. So we do have a couple questions in the Q&A, but just one moment of time remaining. So I'm going to end us off with the question, what is the most interesting fact that you learned from your book? And if you can't sort of think of one that comes to mind, maybe is there something that didn't make it into the book that you wish had? So is there one particular fact that comes to mind that's especially fascinating from the work that you were doing or the work that you learned while working on this book? And we'll just keep the answers brief because we're running up at the end of our time, and I know people have other sessions to go to. So Susan, can I start with you?
One small, very interesting fact is skateboarding is, everyone around the world loves skateboarding, and Brazil especially has amazing skateboarders.
I did not know that.
No, neither did I.
Patchen, what about you? Any exciting facts?
Well, I don't know an exciting fact, but my favorite pattern didn't really make it into the book, which is the pattern that's on giraffe's skin. It's the pattern of dried up lake beds, and it's the pattern of tree bark. It's in dragonfly wings. It doesn't even have a name. Like, it's not a spiral. It's not a branch. It's not that sort of thing. But it is a pattern that shows up over and over and over again in so many different places. I find it fascinating and beautiful, and I wish I could have written a whole book just about that pattern.
Your next book.
Yeah, exactly. The sequel.
Heather, what about you?
I just want to say that was actually my favorite page in Patchen's book, where he shows all those patterns together right next to each other. I thought it was completely fascinating. For me, it's not one fact as well, but I would say it's the idea that children of all ages, so desperately wanted an education that they were willing to risk their lives to get it, and to break the laws, to do these things that we take for granted in North America, I would say. So that, I think that would be my thing. It was just how determined they were to get an education.
Great point. And Sophie, how about you, to to conclude any?
Oh, I learned many, many things because I hadn't, you know, it wasn't my domain or my field of expertise, but I can show you a few. I was really surprised to learn that, you know, kids who work on the street, this is in Ecuador, have the opportunity to go to school on the street. The teachers go to them and have systems set up so that the kids can learn a certain number of things. So the school chapter was definitely, you know, floating schools. I thought it was like amazing. I didn't know they existed, you know, with computers. But then small details also like this, that, so where's this? This is in New Guinea. That babies are carried in, see on the mother's back, like in a net, like a bag. Like you carry your baby around in a bag, but it's a net. But yeah, so I thought this was fascinating. All these small details that Susan went to, you know, they're so interesting in them, you know, just in themselves.
Yeah, so different from what we might expect, and that makes all these books really, really wonderful. It's all the facts we can learn from them. So thank you everyone so much for being part of this panel. This was wonderful. Attendees, thank you for joining us. And if you do want to check out these books, there are PDFs available in our booths. You can just click on the little request for review copies link, and you can find out more. And thank you so much for joining us. Hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.